Ah, yes, we're on. Friendly greetings. It's me, Torley, and you may see here. I'll try to flip this in post-production. If it looks inversed, then I failed. But I'm on a big nostalgia trip recently. I did not even know this magazine, the America Online Guide to Multimedia Online, aptly enough. Surprisingly, Volume 2, Issue 3, and I wonder how many issues in a volume. I found this at the thrift store the other day, and I've been feeling very nostalgic. It was great timing. It's hilarious because, very apt, as I've said, that Thomas Dolby is on the cover. You may recognize him from She Blinded Me with Science. Of course, I really enjoyed his soundtrack to Gate to the Mind's Eye, which was a really seminal computer animated film with his distinctive, catchy, poppy melodies. He always has quirky sounds too. And he gives his insights on the future of digital music. And this hails from, when was this? 1996. So I was looking online at YouTube for rare episodes of CNET Central and of America Online's early screenshots, because I grew up on, I think it was AOL 2.7 on the Mac, 2.8 to version 3, as well as later transitioning and using the old Netscape Navigator. So all the pixel goodness comes back. A time before PNG, a time where MIDI music played intrusively on various GeoCities websites, to name a few memories. As part of my looking back, though, want to share a very important topic that's dear to my heart, and a driving force in my life came to mind, and that happens to be my autism. I have Asperger syndrome. I believe that it's best for me to talk about it and share more about it. I know some of my friends in the past have been hesitant to, understandably, because they put a YouTube video up and they get a lot of hateful comments. It is what happens, unfortunately, and saying something like grow a thick skin isn't necessarily helpful. And the way that I approach it in life is cruel act, almost invariably says more about the person who's doing it than their victim. So with that in mind, not too long ago, now let me try to bundle this together. This is all off the cuff, but these memories rush in. I've got to grab a train and tell you so you have a cohesive story, not some jib-jabbering of nonsensical, mushed up mouchings. Now, when I was very young, of course, every parent, they want to believe the kid is special, and I can't assign any value sorts of judgments. My mother, she was big on finding sorts of grow your gifted kid, grow your talented kid, all those kinds of nourishing, enriching your child books that she would raise me on. And that led me to classical piano, as you may have heard in another video I recently did, for better or worse. I think net gain, it was better, but with some deficits, some trauma that I had to deal with. So if you know me, you can characterize my personality as generally being upbeat. That has not always been the case, of course. It's swung over time, and I hate to use the, if it's cliched, pardon me, phrase real human, or real human with all my quotation marks. I think that's going to become a running joke, but the quotation marks, not the actual thing of being a real human. You get to explore that, and you get to share that in hopes that someone else out there, which is why I am saying this, will be able to relate. And also, I've been on this gunmetal trip, not having the full color spectrum, but sort of not black and white, but monochrome, tilted slightly blue because of looking at film noir. Again, nostalgic for an era in which I did not even exist. So eventually, when I was young, learned about Asperger syndrome, lived in a small town in Canada, had doctors check me out. But it's always those sorts of things in life that if it's so influential, you want to have it be reassured, or reassure yourself, or in other words, have others reassure you that you're not crazy. That's why it's such a concern, mental health. A lot of people think, is it just me? So it helps to get outside help, get professional help. Despite the stigma of it, I think an awful thing is when you portray psychiatrists, the lot of them, as quacks on television, it becomes difficult to approach the actual profession and real people living that, doing that for a living, with an earnest attitude. And the same can be said of other sorts of professions, like lawyers, for instance. So it's important, very important, to walk, just stroll past that and get to know human beings for what they are. So not too long ago, I wanted reassurance. I wanted some questions answered by an expert. So I went and I had a referral made by my doctor for a neuropsych. Dun, dun, dun. That's such a cool word. And so I had an appointment, and my wife, the lovely Ravenel, she came along and we sat on the couch. We didn't lean horizontally. There was not enough room, so we sat clasped hands, really cute couple type thing. And she described what it's like to live with me day to day. Because some things, you see them in my videos, and there's a lot of things, like there's that infamous story of how Mariah Carey, she waves her hand, I forget which hand, in her music videos. It's something subconscious for her. She isn't fully aware she's always doing it. So there's certain traits that I will possess, and I've become more self-aware of some of them over time, but I do wish to have a level of metacognition wherein I'm not so self-aware that I'm crippled about my behavior. Just rock and roll and let the good times flow, which, you may wonder, is atypical of someone with Asperger's. And that has been my journey, or Aspergers to some of you, or Aspergers. It is an ugly word to some, but it was a real Dr. Hans Asperger. It was his real name. So in ridiculing that, any word can be made to sound ugly. Like the Nintendo Wii, remember before that came out, people were saying take a whiz in the Wii. Now look at its success. So do not buckle in and do not bow down to these random, arbitrary combinations of phone memes. Is that phonemes? Phonemes. It's hypnotic phonemes. And so after this initial appointment with the neuropsych, I had another one. And it was like the game Portal. It was, or in Fringe, if you see those TV shows where they lock you in a room and they have you do tests, and that's what I did with the neuropsych's assistant. A memory test to look at pictures and draw them from memory and memorize word pairs and tell stories on things, elucidate on current events. A whole motley crew, and some of it I was frankly quite humiliated and embarrassed because I didn't remember how to do long division from a piece of paper from high school. It just went out my head, but it took me at my mental nakedness. I had a preparation the night before of just good night's sleep, and then went into it, and that's what they simply recommend. I had been well nourished and went into it. So very, very revealing about what they would later find out. Now, I'm not a strict and exclusive proponent of, say, IQ as a form of intelligence, but I think it is fun for people to trade numbers. I think that's part of the novelty. Like you go on Facebook and you have your stats and scores. And so in finding out certain things, in being diagnosed or re-diagnosed, depending how you look at it, with mild Asperger syndrome, because over time I have managed to grow, that I am aware of, and function more socially. This is the hilarious part, because a lot of people are like, dude, you're so good at talking to people, but it wasn't always that way. And a lot of people aren't interested in all the between. There's a lot of everyday process. It's not an intriguing teledrama. They want the before picture, they want the after picture. So little Torley, not good at making eye contact. Now I've learned to have more of an intense gaze and more of a firm handshake and those sorts of things in life. There are still some things in the world that I would like to learn how to do quite competently. One of them, of course, is learning how to drive. It's a road menace for me. It is so difficult, because You ever see some of those sci-fi shows where you have a character, they are telepathic, and these thoughts, like a recent episode of Fringe, are leaking into their head, and they, oh my gosh, I had the worst tangent thought of that. Eat the poop food in the leak. Sorry, this is, you gotta look that up. Eat the poo poo after this. It's just wrong. But in terms of that noise that gets in your head, I have an ability which is unusual to focus intensely for long stretches of time, real marathon deep thought. Now, this comes across with music. It comes across in my work with Second Life, analytical tasks, and quite frankly, the stereotypical, positively so, fixation with various obsessions that Asperger syndrome is often characterized as. I certainly have that. I certainly, sometimes my emotions are a little robotic, but over time I've tried to bust a groove and get more rhythm into things. And I would recommend, without doubt, if you have concerns about your mental health, if you think you may have something like autism, or if something else, it's best to get it checked out. There is that, I understand, there is that fear of, well, you could never find out, but for me, that would just eat away at me. And I'm an explorer, I am curious, and I'd like to find out. So it was just such a relief, and I shared that expression with my wife because it explains so many things that they seem so natural behavior to me, but they seem so unnatural to others. I've never thought that I was particularly more enthusiastic than other people, but this gets pointed out to me frequently. And that's one of the sorts of loose tests I have in life, is when across all sorts of walks of life and backgrounds, people point out a characteristic. And for me, as you've seen from my YouTube comments, it's like, Torley, you're so friendly and such a drive and infectious zeal and zest for life. Indeed, that is the case, but the dark side now. So, no, this is not the part where I confess to serial killing, sadly, or not sadly, if you're a fan of Dexter, who is supported by some speculatively as he is a fictional character to be autistic. No, the dark side is what I also found out in doing my thorough diagnosis with the neuropsych, is that I actually am bipolar. However, it is not a rapid cycling bipolar. It does not happen from day to day, week to week, or even month to month. It happens in the short relative period of my life so far in stretches of years at least, perhaps over a decade, and not evenly. Whoop, the screen went dark. Let me just bring this back on in case my face went dark with it. Pardon me. And so it is quite a concern that after my high school I became quite depressed, and then it was a dark time in my life when I found out about this virtual world, Second Life, and I had a fixation to discover, to explore. And it's so funny that I saw an episode of CNET Central dating back, I think, to 1997, talking about the dawn of online virtual worlds. And I didn't remember that episode until I watched it again. And I thought to myself, this seed must be planted. And 7 years later, would be put in my head, and I would find out about Second Life when I was feeling very, very lonely and isolated. I was in my parents' house after my father had died just a year or so before, and it was one string of family tragedies after another. And so I got in World, and there were other people I found who had Asperger syndrome or were on the autistic spectrum and could relate about their fixations and what they would do in World. So as for me, I decided to go all out with an interest that had charmed me since my childhood, which is the mythical watermelons. And you, if you know me, you know the pink and the green, and sometimes the black and the yellow, which is this is rare. The black is tertiary, it's mandatory. The yellow is optional. And I really got into there and talking with other people and finding about other people's experiences and their pain and sorrow. And so Second Life has been tremendously healing for my mental health. I remember in the early years of me being there too, about 2004, 2006, hearing a lot of hubbub about the positive therapy and people getting to know one another, people despite disabilities, because there is that saying that if they can't really see you behind the keyboard, they aren't in a position to judge that, whether some people, they just have that subconscious, or they want to believe that they aren't prejudiced, but something within them is wired that way. So really the question of self-discovery and why are we this way? And for me, it was this amazing journey until I found my legs back with music. Now, in the interim part of my life story, I also had hyperacusis, which is part of why I was depressed after my dad's death. After I listened to too much loud music and there was an accident with the car making a noise, loud noise. And so my ears I still can't. My hearing is still not restored. It's awful. I was trying to watch The Social Network with my wife yesterday, and I had to turn it so loud. First, there was big dynamic range, the Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross bass drums in part, great punchy stuff. But the dialogue, so much of it was overlaid atop crowd noise, like when they're in the restaurant, and I couldn't hear it. I had to turn the subtitles on. To this day, I often use headphones, and a lot of gamers, it's intriguing, that instead of having surround sound speakers with unwieldy wires, will turn to headphones, quality headphones. And these, I replaced the ear pads on these not too long ago. These would have been with me about a decade or close to that. Actually, I got them in 2002 or 3, so nearing that. But my hyperacusis, what it means is I do have tinnitus or tinnitus. Sometimes I hear ringing, and it's awful. It's awful. I listen to too much loud music. And this is not a nag, scold you to, but I want to tell you, not to be overly preachy, but I do want to emphasize, keep your hearing vital. And so hyperacusis for me is painful. I often hear things as if they are underwater when they're not, or they're muffled. My frequency spectrum is messed up. So a lot of people don't realize that I have Asperger syndrome. They don't realize that I'm bipolar. They've never been at the Valley, one of my cycles. That was years ago. They have never been... They aren't aware that I am also hearing disabled. So sometimes also, if I pronounce things an odd way, that is a combination of my traits. It's actually, I think it's comorbid because of just the way I enunciate. I attempt to do it clearly and with great passion and fortitude, because that is ultimately what matters. Someone with a thick accent. I admire so many people on YouTube who speak, who are polyglots, multilingual, but their English gets through despite being broken because they have such wonderment about them. So in my case, sometimes I just can't even really hear, and I have deaf relatives. It's genetic in the family to have a fragile hearing, and one of my uncles tried to speak English, but sometimes you hear someone who is deaf and they're not mute, but they try to speak and lip read, and of course it sounds awkward. And because they have no material to reference that. So I'm detached. I'm detached in a number of ways, and I do feel envious. I do wish I had all my hearing faculties, golden ears back, but unless they have some miraculous hearing. And I've actually looked into getting a hearing aid or perhaps a temporary eye app solution on my iPod. And it's not at the stage where I can't hear what's being whispered very closely, but often in crowds and public places, I can't make heads or tails. And the embarrassing part of it is that I would have to nod and smile. And I've had people, unfortunately, treat me quite rudely when I ask them to repeat things, because you sometimes think, oh, if you're old, you're hard of hearing. And that's no slight against the elderly, but things do go with age. And for me now, my hearing is probably what it is for people who are several decades older. And so I can't hear and enjoy music the way I used to. As a consequence, my ears also get fatigued listening so long. which is why despite doing things like the project presets, it's sometimes quite arduous. And I do use computer-assisted, thank goodness for technology, thank goodness. I use computer-assisted matching like RepliQ from Bias software. It's a wonderful, wonderful package for helping me match equalization curves to what I can't hear. The funny thing is when I hear the finished result, it sounds wrong to me, but it matches it to something that most people would typically and broadly find aesthetically pleasing. And from the comments thus far, I love the feedback, and it's really, really useful and fun for me to get that and to be told, okay, it sounds great. How did you get such a punchy kick drum? Well, there's part of the big answer. I mix how I can, but technological tools have really helped the things that I can't necessitate by my own whims. So I wanted to share this. It just was feeling in that sort of mood today, and we're past 20 minutes now. If you've considered these aspects of your health, look further and don't let stigma put you off. Like I've said, go for a checkup, have your health. You can always make more money, but you can't make more time, is something that I've been saying a lot of recently. And between my meditations and really focusing on the beauties of the world, it's an intriguing sort of contradictory gravity and attraction that I have. Some of you have read some of my synopsises on, is that even a plural, on yes.torley.com. And they seem quite dark, from a dark place of the world. And that's largely because I am reflecting on nostalgia. I am reflecting on a time in my youth when I wanted to be a horror fiction writer. Little known facts, eh? And I penned these as perhaps a way of getting back, but in the meantime, I do the music. And if you have been enjoying the music, I thank you graciously so much for listening, liking, and loving it. So this is it's been an honor and a privilege to share part of my story with you, and there will be more to come. Next up on my blog at yes.torley.com, I'm going to talk more about nostalgic elements, including some of the backstory behind the 8bit.me soundtrack, which I've been quite overjoyed to do. Those guys are so clever and fun. All right, goodbye for now. A friendly goodbye nonetheless.